The emergence of Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. In France, after the June Days, the Constituent Assembly, with General Cavaignac as a virtual dictator, set about drafting a republican constitution. It was decided, in view of the disturbances just passed, to create a strong executive power in the hands of a president to be elected by universal male suffrage. It was decided also to have this president elected immediately, even before the rest of the Constitution was finished. 932 four candidates presented themselves: Lamartine, Cavaignac, Ledru-Rollin, and Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. The poet Lamartine stood for a somewhat vaguely moral and idealistic republic, Cavaignac for a republic of disciplined order, Ledru-Rollin for somewhat chastened social ideas. What Bonaparte stood for was not so clear. He was, however, elected by an avalanche of votes in December 1848, receiving over 5,400,000, compared to only 1,500,000 for Cavaignac, 370,000 for Ledru-Rollin, and a mere 18,000 for Lamartine. Bonaparte's background. Thus entered upon the European stage the second Napoleon. Born in 1808, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte was the nephew of the great Napoleon. His father, Louis Bonaparte, was at the time of his birth the King of Holland. When Napoleon's own son died in 1832, Louis Napoleon assumed the headship of the Bonaparte family. He resolved to restore the glories of the Napoleonic Empire. With a handful of followers, he tried to seize power at Strasbourg in 1836 and at Boulogne in 1840, leading what the following century would know as putschs. Both failed ridiculously. Sentenced to life imprisonment in the fortress of Ham, he had escaped from it as recently as 1846 by simply walking off the grounds dressed as a stonemason. He professed advanced social and political ideas, and he wrote 2 books. Napoleonic Ideas claimed that his famous uncle had been misunderstood and checkmated by reactionary forces. His other book, Extinction of Poverty, was a somewhat anti-capitalist tract like many others in this era of early industrial capitalism. But he was no friend of anarchists, and in the spring of 1848, while still a refugee in England, he even joined a special constable force to oppose the Chartist agitation. He soon returned to France. Compromised neither by the June Days nor by their repression, he was supposed to be a friend of the common people, and at the same time a believer in order, and his name was Napoleon Bonaparte. 518-933. For 20 years, a groundswell had been stirring the popular mind. It is known as the Napoleonic legend. Peasants put up pictures of the emperor in their cottages, fondly imagining that it had been Napoleon who gave them the free ownership of their land. The completion of the Arch of Triumph in 1836 drove home the memory of imperial glories, and in 1840 the remains of the emperor were brought from St. Helena and majestically interred at the Invalides on the banks of the Seine. All this happened in a country where most people had little political experience or political sense except what they had gained in revolution. When millions were suddenly, for the first time in their lives, asked to vote for a president in 1848, the name of Bonaparte was the only one they had ever heard of. "How should I not vote for this gentleman?" said an old peasant, "I whose nose was frozen at Moscow." So Prince Louis Napoleon became president of the Second Republic by an overwhelming popular mandate, in which an army officer was his only faintly successful rival. He soon saw the way the wind was blowing. The Constituent Assembly dissolved itself in May 1849 and was replaced by the Legislative Assembly. Although this new legislative body was established under the provisions of the new Republican Constitution and was elected by universal male suffrage, it was a strange assembly for a republic. 500 of the Second Republic's newly elected deputies, or 2/3, were really monarchists, but they were divided into irreconcilable factions: the Legitimists, who favored the line of Charles Tex, and the Orleanists, who favored that of Louis Philippe. 1/3 of the deputies called themselves Republicans. Of these, in turn, about 180 were socialists of one kind or another, and only about 70 were political or old-fashioned Republicans, to whom the main issue was the form of government rather than the form of the economy or society itself. Louis Napoleon becomes president. The president and the assembly at first combined to conjure away the specter of socialism with which republicanism itself was now clearly associated. An abortive insurrection of June 1849 provided the chance. 934. The assembly, backed by the president, ousted 33 socialist deputies, suppressed public meetings, and imposed controls on the press. In 1850, it went so far as to rescind universal male suffrage, taking the vote away from about a third of the electorate, naturally the poorest and hence most socialistic third. The Falloux Law of 1850 put the schools at all levels of the education system under supervision of the Catholic clergy. For, as M. Falloux said in the Assembly, lay teachers have made the principles of social revolution popular in the most distant villages. And it was necessary to rally around religion to strengthen the foundations of society against those who want to divide up property. The French Republic, now actually an anti-republican government, likewise intervened forcefully against the revolutionary republic that Mazzini had established in the city of Rome. French military forces were sent to Rome to protect the Pope. They remained there 20 years. Anti-republican government, Bonaparte knew that his repression of the socialists made him virtually indispensable for the conservatives. They were so sharply divided between two sets of monarchists, legitimist and Orleanist, that each would accept any anti-socialist regime rather than yield to the other. Bonaparte's problem was to win over the radicals. He did so by urging in 1851 the restoration of universal suffrage, which he had himself helped repeal in 1850. He now posed as the people's friend, the one man in public life who trusted the common man and stood against those he portrayed as greedy plutocrats in the Legislative Assembly. He put his lieutenants in as ministers of war and of the interior, thus controlling the army, the bureaucracy, and the police. On December 2nd, 1851, the anniversary of his uncle's famous victory at the Battle of Austerlitz, he sprang a well-organized coup d'etat. Placards 519 appeared all over Paris. They declared the assembly dissolved and the vote for every adult Frenchman reinstated. When members of the assembly tried to meet, they were attacked, dispersed, or arrested by the 935 soldiers. The country did not submit without fighting. 150 persons were killed in Paris, and throughout France, probably 100,000 were put under arrest. But on December 20th, the voters elected Louis Napoleon president for a term of 10 years, by a vote officially stated as 7,439,016 to 646,737. A year later, the new Bonaparte proclaimed the empire, with himself as emperor of the French. Remembering Napoleon's son who had died, he called himself Napoleon III. French Republicans had lost more than the political institutions of the Second Republic. The Republic as Republicans understood it, an egalitarian, anti-clerical regime with socialist or at least anti-bourgeois tendencies, had been dead since June 1848. Feeble anyway, it was killed by its reputation for radicalism. Liberalism and constitutionalism were dead also, at least in the political institutions by which the new Napoleon now governed France. Republicans and monarchists were all pushed aside, and for the first time since 1815, France ceased to have any significant parliamentary life. The demise of parliamentary government. 59. Vienna, the nationalist revolutions in Central Europe and Italy. The Austrian Empire in 1848. The Austrian Empire of the Habsburgs, with its capital at Vienna, was in 1848 the most populous European state, except Russia. Its peoples, living principally in the three major geographical divisions of the empire, Austria, Bohemia, and Hungary, were of about a dozen recognizably different nationalities or language groups: Germans, Czechs, Magyars, Poles, Ruthenians, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, Dalmatians, Romanians, and Italians. See map P 484. In some parts of the empire, 936th, the nationalities lived in solid blocks, but in many regions, two or more were interlaced together, the language changing from village to village, or even from house to house, in a way quite unknown in Western Europe. Germans were the most numerous national group. They occupied all of Austria proper and considerable parts of Bohemia, and were scattered also in small pockets throughout Hungary. The Czechs occupied Bohemia and the adjoining Moravia. The Magyars were the dominant group in the historic Kingdom of Hungary, which contained a mixture of nationalities with a considerable number of Slavic peoples. Two of the most economically advanced parts of Italy also belonged to the empire: Venetia, with its capital at Venice, and Lombardy, whose chief city was Milan. The diversity of the empire. The Czechs, Poles, Ruthenians, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes, and Dalmatians in the empire were all Slavs. That is, their languages were all related to one another and to the several forms of Russian. Neither the Magyars nor the Romanians were Slavs. The Magyars, as national sentiment grew, prided themselves on the uniqueness of their language in Europe, and the Romanians prided themselves on their linguistic affiliations with the Latin peoples of the West. Romanians, Magyars, and Germans formed a thick belt separating the South Slavs from those of the North. The peoples of the empire represented every cultural and economic level of 19th century Europe. Vienna recognized no cultural or scientific peer except Paris, and Milan was a great center of trade. Bohemia had long had an important textile industry, which was beginning to be mechanized in the 1840s. 62. Bonapartism, the Second French Empire, 1852 to 1870. The new realism in European culture after 1848 extended also to the exercise of post-revolutionary political power. We have seen how Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, elected president of the French Republic in 1848, soon made himself emperor of the French with the title of Napoleon III. Those willing to fight for the parliamentary and liberal institutions that he crushed were silenced. He became chief of state and then emperor in 1852 on a wave of popular acclaim. Political institutions of the Second Empire. Napoleon III, like Napoleon I, came to power because of the fear of radicalism in a discredited republic. Otherwise, he bore little resemblance to his famous uncle. He was not a professional soldier or a great 975 organizer. When he became president of the republic at the age of 40, he had been an adventurer and a conspirator, but he undoubtedly felt more concern than Napoleon I for the plight of the working classes. Where Napoleon I had been disdainful of public opinion, his nephew recognized it as an opportunity, not a nuisance, and he appealed to the masses by giving them the vote, however useless, by promises of prosperity, and by pageantry. He understood perfectly that a single leader exerts more magnetism than an elected assembly, and he knew that a Europe still shuddering over the June days was hoping desperately for order in France. 542. He gloried in modern progress. Napoleon III boldly offered himself as the strong leader who would move France toward a brave new world. Like his uncle, he announced that he embodied the sovereignty of the people. He said that he had found a solution to the problem of mass democracy. In all the other great continental states and in Great Britain, in 1852, universal suffrage was thought to be incompatible with intelligent government and economic prosperity. Napoleon III claimed to put them together. Like Marx and other realists after 1848, he held that elected parliamentary bodies, far from representing an abstract people, only accentuated class divisions within a country. He declared that the regime of the restored Bourbons and the July monarchy had been dominated by special interests, that the Republic of 1848 had fallen into the hands of a distrustful assembly that robbed the laboring man of his vote, and that France would find in the empire the permanent, popular, and modern system for which it had been vainly searching since 1789. He affirmed that he stood above classes and would govern equally in the interests of all. In any case, like many other political leaders after 1848, he held that forms of government were less important than economic and social realities. Napoleon III's view of progress, 976. The political institutions of the Second Empire were therefore authoritarian, modeled on those of the consulate of the First Bonaparte. There was a council of state composed of experts who drafted legislation and advised on technical matters. There was also an appointive Senate and a legislative body, which was elected by universal male suffrage in carefully managed elections. But the legislative body had no real power to make laws, set the budget, or control the army. Parliamentary life was reduced almost to absolute zero. Authoritarian political institutions. To captivate public attention and glorify the Napoleonic hack's name, the new emperor set up a sumptuous court at the Tuileries. balked in the ambition to marry into one of the great dynasties, Napoleon III chose as his empress a young Spanish noblewoman, Eugenie, who was destined to outlive the empire by 50 years, dying in 1920. It was said to be a love match, a sure sign of popularized royalty. The court life of the empire was brilliant and showy beyond anything known at the time in St. Petersburg or Vienna, and the pageantry was expanded into the embellishment of the city of Paris. Baron Haussmann, who served as Napoleon III's creative, strong-willed city planner for major renovations in the French capital, gave Paris much of the appearance that it has today. He built roomy railway stations with broad approaches, and he constructed a system of boulevards and public squares, offering long vistas ending in fine buildings or monuments, as at the Place de l'Opéra. He also modernized the sewers and the water supply. The building program, like the expensive court, had the additional advantage of stimulating business and employment. And the cutting of wide avenues through the crooked streets and congested old houses would permit easier military operations against insurrectionists entrenched behind barricades should the events of 1848 ever be repeated. Economic developments under the empire. 977. It was as a great social engineer that Napoleon III preferred to be known. In his youth, he had tried to understand the riddle of modern industrialism, and now, as emperor, he found some of his main backers in former Saint-Simonians, who called him their socialist emperor. Saint-Simon, it may be recalled, had been among the first to conceive of a centrally planned industrial system. But the Saint-Simonians of the 1850s shared the new desire to be realistic, and their most significant triumph was the invention of investment banking, by which they hoped to guide economic growth through the concentration of 543 financial resources. They founded a novel kind of French banking institution, the Crédit Mobilier, which raised funds by selling its shares to the public, and with the funds thus obtained bought stock in such new industrial enterprises as it wished to develop. France entered a new phase of rapid economic development through a distinctive French version of the Industrial Revolution. The times were exceedingly favorable for expansion, for the discovery of gold in California in 1849, and in Australia soon afterward, together with the newly organized credit facilities, brought a substantial increase in the European money supply, which had a mildly inflationary effect. The steady rise of prices encouraged the expansion of new companies and the investment of capital. Railway mileage, increasing everywhere in the Western world, increased in France from 3,000 to 16,000 kilometers in the 1850s. The demand for rolling stock, iron rails, auxiliary equipment, and building materials for stations and freight houses kept the mines and factories busy. The railway network was rationalized, 55 small lines in France being merged into 6 big regional trunks. Iron steamboats replaced wooden sailing ships. Between 1859 and 1869, a French company built the Suez Canal, which it continued to own for almost a century, though the British government after 1875 was the principal stockholder. Expansion 978 large French corporations made their appearance, in railroads and banking, first of all. In 1863, the law granted the right of limited liability, by which a stockholder could not lose more than the par value of the stock, however insolvent or debt-burdened the corporation might become. This encouraged investment by persons of both smaller and larger means in enterprises of which they knew very little. Thus, the wealth and savings of the country were more effectively mobilized and put to work. The stock exchange boomed. Financiers, those whose business was to handle money, credit, and securities, assumed a new eminence in the capitalistic world as more investors bought shares in the new industrial companies. Many people became very rich, richer perhaps than anyone had ever been in France before. The emperor aspired also to do something for the working class, within the limits of the existing system. Jobs were plentiful and wages were good, by the ideas of the day, at least until the temporary depression of 1857. The emperor had a plan, as did some of the Saint-Simonians, for organizing forces of workers in military fashion and setting them to clear and develop uncultivated land. Not much was done in this direction. More was accomplished in the humanitarian relief of suffering. Hospitals and asylums were established, and free medicines were distributed. The outlines of a social welfare state began somewhat vaguely to appear. Meanwhile, the workers were building up unions. All combinations of workers had been prohibited during the French Revolution, a prohibition that was deemed to be still in force until the ambiguous legal position of labor unions began to change. In 1864, it even became legal for organized workers to go on strike. Large labor units, or unions, and large business units, or corporations, were thus legalized at the same time. Napoleon III hardly did enough for labor to rank as a working-class hero, but he did enough to be suspected as socialistic by many middle-class people of the day. Napoleon's socialistic initiatives 979. Later authoritarian regimes, bent like the Second Empire on a program of economic development, were usually highly protectionist, but Napoleon III believed in freedom of international trade. He had a project for a tariff union with Belgium, which some Belgians also supported. Belgium was already well industrialized, and a Franco-Belgium 544 union, especially because Belgium had the coal that France lacked, would have formed a trading area of very great strength. The plan was blocked by private interests in both countries, however, and strongly opposed by both Great Britain and the German Zollverein. The emperor then turned to an all-around reduction of import duties. Since the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846, the free traders were in power in England. They were eager to abolish trade barriers between Britain and France. Napoleon III, overriding unusual opposition in his legislative body, concluded a free trade treaty with Great Britain in 1860. He set aside 40 million francs of government funds to assist French manufacturers in making adjustments to British competition. But this sum was never spent in full, which suggests that French industry was generally able to compete successfully with the more intensively mechanized industry of Britain. The Anglo-French Treaty was accompanied by lesser trade agreements with other countries. It looked in the 1860s as if Europe might actually be about to enter a new era of economic cooperation and free trade. Free Trade Treaty with Britain. 980 Napoleon III's ambitious plan to rebuild the city of Paris became one of the great urban projects of modern times. Organized by the strong-willed Baron Haussmann, the systematic, controversial reconstruction of Parisian streets, parks, buildings, sewers, and monuments transformed the city and produced an aesthetic grandeur that has drawn visitors ever since. This illustration from a London newspaper in the 1860s shows work crews and equipment at a demolition site on the left bank of the Seine. Popper photo, Getty Images. 545 Internal difficulties and war. But by 1860, the empire was running into trouble. It took a few years to overcome the Depression of 1857. By his policy of free trade, the emperor made enemies among certain industrialists. The Catholics objected to his intervention in Italy, where he briefly joined an anti-Austrian military campaign in 1859. After 1860, opposition mounted. The emperor granted more leeway to the long subservient legislative body. The 1860s are called the decade of the liberal empire, all such terms being relative. The empire might have evolved through these internal changes, but Louis Napoleon actually ruined himself by war before internal reforms could have much effect. His empire evaporated on the battlefield in 1870, but he was at war long before that. 981. The empire means peace, he had assured his audiences in 1852. Yet war is, after all, a supreme form of pageantry, or was then. France was the strongest country in Europe, and the emperor's name was Napoleon. Less than a year and a half after the proclamation of the empire, France was at war with a European state for the first time since Waterloo. The enemy was Russia, and the war was fought mainly on the Crimean Peninsula along the north coast of the Black Sea. Although Napoleon III did not alone instigate the Crimean War, this conflict showed his inclination to send French armies abroad. In 1859, the new Napoleon was fighting in Italy from 1862 to 1867 in Mexico, and in 1870 in France itself, in a war with Prussia that he could easily have avoided. These wars were limited in scope and duration, as compared to the huge Napoleonic wars in the early 19th century, but they formed part of the wider European struggles for international influence. which are discussed in the next chapter. The empire means peace. It is enough to say here that in 1870, the Second Empire went the way of the First, into the limbo of governments tried and discarded by the French. It had lasted 18 years, exactly as long as the July Monarchy, and longer than any other regime known in France up to that time, since the fall of the Bastille. Not until the 20th century, when dictators sprouted all over Europe, did people begin to recognize that the authoritarian Louis Napoleon and his strongman uses of state power had been an anti-democratic omen of the future, rather than a bizarre reincarnation of the past.